The verses from Mark chapter 2 today are ones that I think are kind of confusing for a lot of people. I know they were certainly confusing for me at one point and still are somewhat, but I think hopefully this can bring a little bit of clarity. If Jesus is the king who wants true followers, and if he's the Son of God who's also wanting true worshipers, what this passage is talking about is what does it look like to worship God sort of in the new way that Jesus is bringing. Jesus, I think, was seeing old, stale, kind of dead, like unloving versions of religion and religious practices. And I think he's trying to show that what he's bringing is that different than that. He's bringing something new, and so people need to think about it in a new way. Okay, so let's read the verses. It's Mark chapter 2, verses 18 through 22. It said, "Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting." And by the way, this is John the Baptist, the guy who baptized Jesus. "Some people came and asked Jesus, 'How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?' Jesus answered, 'How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, otherwise the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins.'" Okay, so again, we're talking about fasting, we're talking about wineskins, what's going on? Let's talk about fasting first. What is fasting? I think, unfortunately, fasting is something that in the 21st century in the church, we don't really do very much, probably because we think it's too difficult and we just don't have the patience to fast. But what is fasting? What's the point? I think the point is that in life and in the world, we sometimes get so full of worldly things, whether that's just worldly entertainment, all these things making our lives busy, and including food. Sometimes you eat in life. Sometimes you can eat so much that even if something good is offered you to eat, you don't want any more. And so the idea of fasting is we can get so full of worldly things that we don't have room in our hearts and in our lives for God. And so when you fast, you are emptying yourself of food, or like you're foregoing food to create space and a hunger for God. To fast is saying, I'm hungry for God. I'm longing for God instead of these worldly things. So instead of food, I'm choosing God in this moment. Similarly, I think if anyone does fast these days, it's usually from like social media or their phone. But the point of that is that I'm emptying myself, or I'm foregoing hearing from my phone all the time. I'm trying to create space to really hear from God. I don't need to hear from all my friends and from social media right now. I need to hear from God. That's the idea of fasting, creating some space and some emptiness to make room for God. Now, Jesus is saying in this passage, they're questioning and saying, why aren't your disciples doing this? And he's saying, if the idea of fasting is because you have this longing for the Lord, well, guess what? I'm here. He says, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? He's saying that would be really silly if a groom is at a wedding, if you're at a wedding feast, like why would you be like mourning and like sort of longing for the groom to be there? He's there. So just enjoy the feast. This should be an exciting time. But he does say that there's going to be this moment where the bridegroom is taken away. In other words, like Christ is not currently here in the flesh with us. And he says, on that day, my disciples will fast. And similarly for us now, I think God actually does expect us to fast. It is not something I do well or often, but I do think that there's times where it's good to create space in my life to mix up and forego my normal routine, because I can get so full of worldly things that I don't make room and space for God. Okay, and then finally he ends this with two analogies that they would have understood back then. It's harder for us to understand now. But I do actually think we can get it. So he says, you don't put a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If you have a new piece of cloth, I think if you have like a new shirt or something, um, it when you wash it, it shrinks a little bit. And so if you were to take an old shirt that is no longer going to shrink, and you patch a hole in it with a new piece of cloth that's going to shrink, as soon as you wash that shirt, it's going to tear again because you've tried to put something new onto something old. Hope that made sense. The same was true back then for wineskins. Wine, if you didn't know, when it's like new and still kind of fermenting, kind of expands a little bit. And so the way they would store wine back then was in kind of leather, like canteens or like leather skins. And so if you take new wine that's going to expand and you put it in an old leather thing, I don't know if you realize this, but like leather as it ages kind of gets like stiff and like rigid and like more like firm. It's as it ages, and so it's not flexible anymore. That's a good way to say it. It's no longer flexible. And so if you put new wine into that unflexible wineskin, the whole thing's just going to break actually. Like the wine's going to expand and the whole thing's going to burst. So you need to put new wine in new wineskins. And people back then would have totally known that. What does this mean for us? I think what Jesus is saying is like the difference, new wine and old wine might look very similar, but you just have to treat them kind of differently. And similarly for us, religious practices, things like praying, things like fasting, things like reading your Bible, things like going to church, there's an old, like, unflexible, rigid, dead religious way to do those things that create no joy and no actual, like, longing and relationship with God. On the outside, you might be doing all these things, but really they are of no benefit to you because it's not coming from this love and, like, true longing for Christ. That's just a bunch of performance. And Jesus is saying that is not the kind of worship that I'm looking for. Okay? If you try to like fit Christ into this old kind of dead religious practices, it's just going to like not work for you. Okay? And the tear is going to become worse, he says. It's actually going to be worse. What he's saying is, yeah, you're still probably going to fast. You're going to pray. You're going to read your Bible. But there has to be this new way of doing it, this new way of really engaging Christ in a relationship. As a Christian, yes, you'll do all those religious things. You'll pray. You'll go to church. You'll read your Bible. But what is this new, real, living way of doing it? That's what Jesus is trying to teach his disciples. He's saying, like, erase in your mind kind of this old idea that you have of what it means to worship God. We have to like think about it in a new living way. Those are the kinds of followers I'm looking for.